También, además de director de este SITAC, yo voy a ser una especie de Billy Crystal para presentar a la gente en Noche de Oscar. Y entonces, en día de charlas y pláticas, me gustaría invitar a Joshua Decter, profesor y curador independiente, profesor en Bard College. Por favor, den las bienvenidas a Joshua Decter.
Are you going to interview me before my talk? That's fine.
No, I guess you're going to show something, no? You're going to use the projector?
Yes, I'm going to use the I'm going to use the projector. Yeah, but you can stay here. It's fine. It would be nice. Okay.
I'll stay with you.
Let me just turn my stuff on. Hola, buenos dias. I'm going to do my presentation in English because my Spanish skills are impoverished, so I apologize for that. I want to thank Ivo Mesquita for the invitation to participate in SITAC and the entire SITAC organization. You all know who you are for supporting this special event. This is my second visit to Mexico City, and it's a fascinating place, so I appreciate being here again. I'm going to do a rather perhaps schizophrenic presentation this morning, which perhaps reflects to a certain extent the confusion I have about how I should proceed here today. I will talk initially and rather quickly about an exhibition project that I organized for the Santa Monica Museum of Art in Los Angeles, which opened in January 2006 and closed in April 2006, entitled Dark Places, which perhaps could be understood as an example of a certain kind of interdisciplinary curatorial project in which I work with an architectural group to develop a somewhat unusual exhibition design for the projection of digital artworks and architectural projects. And then I will quickly shift to a reflection which I think might be somewhat more appropriate for the context here, although I'm not quite sure if I'm going to be impudent or impertinent enough today for you or to satisfy the guidelines. I'll try to be. I will then talk about my connection with the most recent version of Insight, Insight 05, which was directed by Osvaldo Sanchez. I was one of the interlocutors. There were 5 interlocutors for that project, and I will talk about, in a sense, my perspective on the exhibition in relation to broader questions of artistic intervention in urban space, and also the question of public domain, which I think is perhaps very important in relation to Mexico City and particularly what's going on now. We were just visiting the Zoca yesterday and saw this pretty incredible emplacement. Maybe there's a better word for it, but I see it as a kind of emplacement in this space. I will be let me just first make sure everything is working properly. I'm going to shift to some images and also read some text. Okay. It is somewhat ironic that I've been invited to engage in a conclave entitled Impudent Dialogues, as I've endeavored over the past few years to become less impudent in both my private and professional affairs. Apparently I have failed since I am here with you. But we must learn from our failures, and as one of my favorite fortune cookies recommended, quote, "Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." So I remain enthusiastic. Briefly, the exhibition entitled Dark Places, again, which I organized for the Santa Monica Museum in Los Angeles. I began developing this project a number of years ago. I wanted to produce a visual environment that would be immersive in nature, that would allow for the interpenetration of digitized artworks and architectural projects dealing with, in very diverse and broad ways, questions of psychopathologies of urban space and urban experience. I invited a little bit under 100 participants to engage in this situation. Some of the participants produced new works, others existing works. All the works were digitized. I then produced essentially QuickTime sequences of all of the works. And I worked with this architectural collaborative entitled Servo to produce this exhibition design. I'll show you a couple of graphic images of this and a QuickTime video of the project. This is essentially a topographical image of the exhibition machinery. The apparatus functions to display simultaneously essentially 8 different micro exhibitions continuously. And you'll see that there are different artist names that are connected with their particular works that are sequenced simultaneously throughout each day. So essentially, the viewer is never really able to see the exhibition in its entirety, and one moves from one both rear screen or front screen projector unit to experience these different sequences. I'll show you now a brief video of the project. Having some technical problems. Give me 1 second. I think we're having an information transfer problem. show you briefly the interactive component of the exhibition, which essentially allowed people to access information on the participating artists and architects and on the overall thematic of the exhibition with a touchscreen unit. Each of the touchscreen units essentially was an information base for the 8 individual projection areas. So you have within the exhibition essentially a kind of a didactic kind of informational system that moves through. Okay, so that is the Dark Places exhibition, which again, I see as an attempt to rethink curatorial process in relation to working with architectural language and also sort of rethinking questions of format and display in relation to video practices and other kinds of materials. And also, of course, in terms of questions of readership from the viewer, because in a rather radical way, the attempt here was to give over to the viewers an opportunity to construct meaning in a rather different way, even to essentially move through this situation as a kind of intertextual event. I'm now going to move on to the heart of my presentation today. I've essentially developed 2 titles today for the talk, which might be interchangeable in nature. The heart of the text that I'm going to present today is actually from the essay that I produced for the forthcoming Insight 05 book that will be published this fall. 2 titles I have are Transitory Agencies, Situational Engagements, and Sustainable Collaborations, Reclaiming the City as Public Domain, and Transitory Agencies and Situational Engagements, the Artist as Public Interlocutor. It is central to democracy that the public sphere and public domain, whether we are referring to artistic, intellectual, and other cultural activities for civic benefit or to various forms of political organization, remains an actively contested territory, particularly if we are interested in engaging the imaginations of distinct publics so that they use their right to influence the socio-political space of their cities, rather than existing as a phantom presence, silent majority, consumed exclusively by daily rituals of work, money, family, real estate, and cultural tourism. There are 2 reference points that have been useful for me over the past weeks when I've actually been on vacation, but have used that opportunity to reread one text and to read a new text for the first time, which I think are useful in our situation. One is a brief quote from Manuel Castells, The City and the Grassroots, a Cross-Cultural Theory of Urban Social Change from 1984, in which Castells writes, "We are concerned with the understanding of how cities and societies change on the basis of collective projects and societal conflicts generated through history. Our questions address the issue of how and why the creators challenged the dominants." And the second reference point is from a more recent book from 2001, co-authored by Martin Heijer and Arnold Reindorp, entitled In Search of New Public Domain, in which they write, "The essence of public domain, different groups become attached to a particular place and somehow or other they must reach a compromise. Which code should dominate there? What behavior should be tolerated? Who is allowed to ask whom to adapt? These are questions that are part and parcel of meaningful public space. From our viewpoint, a cultural geographic analysis must tackle both the analysis of the production of all kinds of places and the analysis of the specific way in which those places are used or consumed, sometimes contrary to the intentions of the producer. In the network society, everyone puts together their own city. Naturally, this touches on the essence of the concept of public domain. The modern city is most easily understood as an archipelago of enclaves, and if the citizen is continuously occupied with maintaining his or her own small network with as little possible friction with other groups, then that does indeed ostensibly spell the demise of any form of public domain. However, that is not how the private space of the archipelago resident looks. The paradoxical fact is that many people are still searching for that experience of intensely felt public places. Public domain is, in our firm opinion, not so much a place as an experience. Public domain experiences occur at the boundary between friction and freedom. On the one hand, there is always the tension of a confrontation with the unfamiliar. On the other, the liberation of the experience of a different approach. In the main, our public domain experiences are in fact related to entering the parochial domain of, quote, others. And again, that's from the book In Search of New Public Domain by Martin Heyer and his collaborator. I've developed some questions that will be returned to in various ways and forms throughout today's talk, such as, how are urban territories reactivated through the transitory agencies and situational engagements of artists, architects, and other cultural producers? And is it possible to track the effects or reverberations of such acts, particularly when such art practices are often based on ephemeral events, even calculated material disappearances of artworks? Given that there is no theoretical or practical consensus on what constitutes the public or public space, in what ways have artists contributed to redefining these properties of the urban domain? I just want to say that I don't really have answers to these questions, and I'll use insight, or my experience in insight, as an example of perhaps a way to negotiate through some of these issues. How do we navigate through the various boundaries that segregate various audiences, public constituencies within megacities, comprised of multiple ethnic, ideological, generational, and cultural groups? And how do artists and other cultural producers develop new communication tools to engage more diverse constituencies and publics in order to reactivate alternate forms of urban citizenship? Is it still possible to claim space in the public domain in order to produce, even temporarily, a new condition of public space that is transformative along political, ideological, perceptual, and other lines, for citizens or in collaboration with citizens? If artistic, architectural, and other types of interventions into city space constitute a kind of urban acupuncture, which is an expression used to describe a phase in the urban development of Barcelona, what is the underlying condition that requires treatment beyond the symptoms of an increasingly restricted and restrictive public domain? How have historical definitions, How have historical definitions of public art, site-specificity, relational aesthetics undergone transformation in more recent years, perhaps leading to the evolution of artistic practices that are based more clearly upon models of social responsiveness and symbolic real collaboration, in which the artist functions as a facilitator, intermediary, interlocutor, culture expert, even business partner, to help engineer an alternative proposition for resolving so-called real-life conditions? What does it mean for artists and other cultural producers to intervene in or interrupt the flows and patterns of daily life within today's cities? And does the public, the citizens of a particular city, actually pay attention to these interruptions? If not, are new strategies of communication necessary? If it is true that the public domain, as well as our domains of privacy, whatever is meant by public and private today, have become increasingly securitized, over-regulated spheres of municipal controls, particularly within cities within the United States, what is the role and responsibility of artists, architects, and others to question such developments? Is it tenable to act with impunity without seeking permissions to produce artistic and other interventions in cities? Some more questions. How do we account for the disappearance of art's immateriality into network flows of social encounters, or the redistribution of cultural production into the flows of various urban environments through processes of cooperation, collaboration, negotiation, infiltration, and intervention? Those practitioners, curators, organizers, intellectuals, and others who have intervened with such questions probably understand that we, are at once privileged and marginalized, relevant and irrelevant, that is, immaterial, safely ensconced and vulnerable, talking to ourselves as much as to others, searching for even a fugitive consequentiality in the face of pressures to behave all too politely. Yet are we rehearsing strategies that ensure the exclusivity of our specialized cultural enclave? Or do we have an unbroken faith that certain artistic practices do actually trigger unexpected transformative moments at some point down the line of communicative social encounters, potentially expanding discursive interactions with publics? Where to begin again? At the beach in Playas, outside of Tijuana, on a hot August day, bodies melting in the sun, watching a gringo get shot from a cannon over the dilapidated yet threatening metal fence that separates Mexican sand from US sand, and in the process, transecting a group of psychiatric patients, staging the version of a political demonstration. What happened? Oh, I see. So now we're looking at the... Okay. Here, in Javier Tea's One Flew Over the Void project, which was researched and commissioned for Insight, does the spectacle dissolve into the event, and the event into something more ephemeral, the product of a process that momentarily creates a space of creative impunity and of ethical inquiry regarding the nature of Tea's collaboration with the patients, that is only made possible through a complex network of institutional negotiations and permissions? And actually, Javier Teas is here today, so I don't know whether he will address this project or others, but let me just show a couple of other images from this project. This is the human cannibal showing his passport before he makes his leap across the border. And he's landed on the other in US territory. Have we reached a new phase in the development of art and architectural projects that operate on liminal levels, like the production of critical shadows, rumors, distinct urban mythologies, critical resistances? Transmitting a rumor about one city or the other city without recognizing that particle of information as a rumor, yet participating in the circulation and dissemination of the rumor nonetheless. Another artist who did a project for Insight, Måns Vranga, who's Stockholm-based. The Good Rumor Project is an insertion of dual rumors into the stream of transnational communications and miscommunications about Tijuana and San Diego, and might be understood as a way to produce unusual linguistic slippages and spillages, transgressions of stereotypical rhetorical representations of urban lives. Language itself is a constituent element of public space, a benevolent viral agent infiltrating networks of social exchange. Or, in a Tijuana shopping mall on a warm Saturday evening, you might have been selecting the design for a new shirt, the chosen pattern silkscreen as you waited within the framework of a temporary outdoor clothing shop. What is this establishment? Is it an entrepreneurial endeavor, a cultural project, or something else? You might have asked related questions encountering the same type of clothing products within the context of a La Jolla, California clothing store, such as, who produced these designs? This is La Tienda de Ropa, the clothes shop, a project by the Tijuana-based Bulbo Collective. For Bulbo's Interventions Project, they developed a complex process of collaboration with individuals from diverse economic and social backgrounds in Tijuana, and work with these individuals to develop a new line of clothing designs that were arrived at through an indexing, distillation, and translation of observations of particular locations in the city. In a sense, Bulbo, a localized cultural collective, became temporarily delocalized through their reinscription within the institutional frame of Insight 05. Yet the multi-layered tactics of their project return them, in a sense, to local communities. In my capacity as an interlocutor in Insight, one, in a sense, had to become a porous border, a porous territory of intermediation, negotiating as much with one's own conflicted perspectives on the viability of art's always tenuous negotiation with social space, politics, as with the doubts, hopes, skepticisms, and idealisms of the other various participants. Not an arbiter, instead a generator of critical feedback, an occasional translator of possible meetings. On the bus, in front of an audience, captive, yes, but curious, including a few of the participating artists, one or two patrons, some cultural intellectuals, Insight organizers, and others. Teddy Cruz, who is a Tijuana and San Diego-based architect and urbanist, delivered via microphone a research-laden decoding of Tijuana for us, which also transmitted his political, ethical commitment to developing alternative architectural engagements within this complex, challenging urban territory. At some point in Tijuana, the bus stopped, we were asked to disembark, our gazes directed towards what appeared, at least to me, as a kind of densely organized favela or shantytown constructed from materials discarded within and recycled from the urban landscape. This was a kind of dilapidated instant neighborhood, a grouping of informal architectures that constituted an apparently unregulated and not sustainable urban habitat produced through tactics of survival. Predictably enough, I was disturbed not only by the living conditions of the inhabitants, but with my own complicity as an observer of what appeared to be a third world environment, at once experiencing the pangs of residual white liberal guilt and confused about what I was supposed to do with this counter-anthropological experience. Take a picture. Could this become one of the potential settings for an artist's intervention within Insight 05? The platform of a community-based engagement designed to improve conditions on the ground. Although I was inspired by Teddy Cruz's discourse and his commitment, I was also skeptical about my own presence in the situation, perhaps typical of a New Yorker's self-protective caution. So I endeavored to utilize this experience to initiate a process of building an immunity to the creeping disease of demoralization, even cynicism, that afflicts those of us, or I'll just say myself, who have begun to lose the capacity to operate beyond our own limited self-interests within the context of the art world. For those of us who have begun to lose the capacity to imagine that art practices, curatorial organization, and related cultural labor might actually have the capacity to interrupt the normative patterns of daily human traffic, the habits of mind, even for just a brief moment. I don't think I need to talk about the history of insight itself and what insight stands for, but I will say that it's insight's evolution since the early 90s has in a sense been a nexus through which artists have been able to research and develop unusual strategies and tactics of engagement, collaboration, community-based participation, infiltration, and within the 2005 version, explore notions of intervention. And by logical extension, essentially retesting notions of what constitutes public art. In interventions, one of the principal objectives I think of Osvaldo Sanchez, the artistic director, was to focus more on questions of liminal space, of flows, of information flows, of bodies, flows of experience, to in some way dislocate from the border as a point of fixation, and also to encourage the various participants to produce projects that would not necessarily fetishize the border, or to avoid producing, let's say, littering the urban scape of the conurban Tijuana-San Diego territory with objects. And to think about public and public domain as a process, and to develop projects that in some way could be inserted into these various processes of public space and public domain. The artists and architects who participated in interventions, I believe, sought to conceptualize and implement modes of exploring territorial complexities without offering a representational fetish of the border as a literal boundary. This is not to suggest, however, that the border is no longer present to us as a demarcated territory, or that it is completely absent from the consideration and some of the eventual projects of the participating artists and architects. How could it completely disappear from view on either theoretical or pragmatic terms? Even those participants who utilize the territory of the border area in a more situationally specific way, such as Javier Tea's Human Cannonball event, managed to defer from a representational recodification of the boundary. In relation to the curatorial frame established by Sanchez, one of the more perplexing experiences that I can recount over the past 2 to 3 years during the organization of Insight concerns Brazilian artist, Sao Paulo-based artist Rumens Mano, who I encountered once in 2003 at one of the early conversations events during Insight. He was engaged in the preliminary research of his residency to develop his project, which was entitled Visible. And we exchanged a few pleasantries during lunch. After that encounter, both Mano and his Visible project remained fundamentally invisible to many of us who sought to locate it as a materialized phenomenon, beyond rumor and innuendo. Invisibility sometimes has a way of generating a certain degree of mystique and intrigue without question. Mano's project might be emblematic, inadvertently or strategically, of the intriguing contradictions of interventions, an artistic intervention into the liminal territories of the transurban region of Tijuana-San Diego that virtually disappeared from view, and in a sense might have been conceptualized and designed to disappear from the view of normative art-seeking audiences, a type of resistance perhaps to visibility that also functioned metaphorically as a divergence from institutional visibility, or at least emblematic of an anxiety about institutional affiliation and identification. Was this a planned, strategic disappearance into the liminal social sphere, or a tactical withdrawal from presence? Perhaps they're the same thing. Again, have we entered the realm of the work of art in the age of appearances and disappearances, between visibility and invisibility, resurfacing and desurfacing at tactical moments of engagement and disengagement? When can we consider a project to be developed as a strategy of calculated disappearance, or another way of thinking about this, a kind of programmed obsolescence? Perhaps I'm invoking a contradictory scene in which our desire for art and architecture to have a socially engaged vocation is often thwarted by our own limitations as to what might constitute engagement or intervention. And really, what do we want art to accomplish? Is the engineering of a public experience, a social interaction, sufficiently differentiating? How much time do I have? 10 minutes? I want to leave some time for if there are questions, but I'm going to go till about 12, and then we'll have about, I guess, 10 minutes or so of questions. I'm going to talk briefly, and I don't have an image of this, unfortunately, today, but a project that was done by Paul Ramirez Jones for the Insight 05 interventions. There was interventions also was comprised of a number of public discussions with artists that took place beginning in the opening weekend in August, continuing through November. I moderated a few of those. During the one that Paul Ramirez Jones was on, in which he was invited to talk about his project, he offered a rather poignant commentary on his presence at that particular public panel. And rather than explaining his project to the audience, he proceeded to articulate in a, I think, rather persuasive way that it was not appropriate for him to explain anything to this particular audience because they were not the intended receivers of his project. This kind of strategic refusal by Ramirez Jones actually would make more sense to me a few months later when I finally had an opportunity to witness one of the final presentations of his Mi Casa, Su Casa project, which he had been offering at distinct locations throughout the San Diego-Tijuana environs, including a women's prison in Tijuana. The version I saw was presented at a college in San Diego. Essentially, Ramirez Jones explains that he invited the audience that evening to consider giving him a copy of a key to open the door of their home, which he would duplicate immediately on site and give to another member of the audience in exchange for the key to unlock a door in their own home, and so on and so forth. If one were to engage in this symbolic and actual exchange of keys, as I did, you would receive from the artist a memento, a gift, memorializing this unusual contract in trust, an artifact designed by the artist, a key engraved on one side with a representation of two hands overlapping, and on the other, two hands holding keys, suggesting the kind of bond of trust established at that moment between two individuals, involving the sharing of instruments to facilitate mutual transition or mutual trespassing through portals of privacy in the city, suburbia and beyond. To me, Mi Casa, Su Casa was fundamentally about trust, community security, the safety of the private domain, the regulated conditions of public social space versus private property or the ownership of one's space, and how it might be possible to intervene actively in compelling individuals, and by extension communities, to reconsider their trepidation about the person living next door, across town in another economic enclave, or even on the other side of the border. And to conclude, it seems to me that in general terms, Insight, at least interventions, which is the only one that I've been involved in, it seemed to be interested in reconstituting some notion of aesthetic instrumentality to, in some way, trigger different kinds of subjective political agency. Whatever subjective political agency might mean. Also to, at least from my perspective, to seek redemption from what seems to be, the supposed social irrelevance of art, from the anxiety that even as art appears to approach a more intimate relational coupling with the real, it slips further away from consequentiality. I think we enter into these kinds of ruminations, which are not merely rhetorical, because of a curiosity to test out the possible reconstitution of the artist's civic role. I'm not sure what the artist's civic role might be, but at least it's another question. There was no need to agree upon one definition of the public, of public space, of the social, of engagement, of intervention, of infiltration, of commitment, or struggle. Just to be straightforward about our own objectives, desires, limitations, dreams, pragmatics, and even the many complexities and contradictions encountered along the path of most resistance. Of course, if one believes that it is necessary to apply pressure upon habits of mind, upon conventions of idea and action, resistances should be anticipated if not welcomed. We need to be realistic about what and who our various audiences and our publics are, while seeking connections to the imaginations of broader constituencies, come what may. Perhaps to remobilize our artistic, cultural, and intellectual activities as a force of reconnection, but not necessarily reconciliation with ideologically disparate audiences, publics, receivers. A new ethics of engagement might seem reactionary to some, particularly if we still endorse the notion that artists have the capacity, perhaps even the responsibility, of blasting ethical considerations. Yet what is the alternative? One of my general concerns has been, throughout my involvement with interventions and in other situations, the always vexing question of how to connect the dots, so to speak, between artistic architectural interventions, the attendant range of theoretical discourses that constitute the intellectual framework, and those diverse audiences and constituencies that might constitute something called a public. This relation seems quite unpredictable, difficult to map, impossible to control, or dangerous to anticipate. How might we speak more effectively across the discursive borders in relation to how projects such as Insight or any other biennial that takes the city as its site, how these projects perform themselves for multiple publics? What are the various audiences, public constituencies? What is the relationship to these kinds of discourses and practices? How to find effective ways to translate projects to citizens? These are not new issues, these are not new problems, but they seem to get left behind in certain situations. Perhaps as a result of a frustration with not being able to discern the so-called, quote, effect of artistic cultural interventions. Should we endeavor to further develop this skill set in order to gain a better and more realistic understanding of the consequences of our activities and our commitments? Are such questions too pragmatic? Ultimately, all of our nuanced discourses, our best intentions, our ethical reflections, our moral dilemmas, our strategic and tactical choices, our real and apparent ideological and political commitments, our hypocrisies, must be tested out in terms of our actions in the social realm of the city, on the streets, in daily encounters, and other moments of urban interface, in frictions, as Martin Heidegger suggests is the true definition of the public domain. Even with others who may not share our values, our ideological proclivities, our aspirations, or our contradictions. As cultural producers, do we need to be on the front lines of social struggles, or testing the limits of public space, or the agency of art practices, wherever this might take us? I've asked myself such questions again and again over the past few years, and frankly, I don't have any good answers. Thank you. So,
gracias, Joshua. Bueno, vamos a tomar algunas preguntas, si hay preguntas. Creo que necesitamos luz en el auditorio para que podamos ver.
Nada?
Hola, sí, acá. Bueno, mi nombre es Lelia Driven, no sé si acostumbran dar los nombres de quien pregunta, pero yo más que preguntar, quisiera comentar algunas cosas que dijo. Yo creo que hay un exceso de optimismo en cuanto a pensar que se puede estar al frente o a la vanguardia de las luchas sociales. Es decir, eso por un lado, ¿no? En la época en que había verdaderos proyectos de transformaciones sociales, me estoy refiriendo a las primeras décadas del siglo XX con el nacimiento de las vanguardias, y luego en los años 60, el artista o los teóricos no tenían tanta seguridad en cuanto a la posibilidad de participación, lo cual no quiere decir que la obra, ya sea por semejanza o por oposición, no esté de alguna manera connotando o estableciendo referencias con lo que pasa en el espacio de lo social. Eso sin duda, la obra siempre guarda relaciones. Y la otra cosa es, a mí me llama mucho la atención que hablen de infiltración. ¿Pero cuál infiltración? A mí me pone muy dudosa el tema de infiltrarse, digamos, en los estadios de poder de lo social. Yo más bien sospecho que eso que se llama infiltración, y quisiera no adjetivar demasiado esta palabra que me parece muy incómoda y muy confusa, yo creo que hablar de infiltración es la mejor manera de aprovechar aquellas cosas que los sectores de poder pueden dar a la producción de la obra. Pero además esto es justamente muy interesante, no sé si puedo explicarlo bien, pero bueno, el hecho de que se juegue o que pecule con la infiltración también es un signo de lo que está ocurriendo precisamente ahora, o sea, de las relaciones que existen entre sociedad, mercado, poder político, poder ideológico, poder cultural, poder artístico y los productores. Eso es lo más interesante de este término que parece tan loco, infiltración. Los que estuvimos en las luchas sociales de los años 60, no se nos ocurría infiltrarnos en el mundo del poder artístico o social. Las infiltraciones tenían connotaciones mucho más terribles, mucho más riesgosas y mucho más concretas, contundentes. O sea, se infiltraba el ejército, se infiltraba la policía, se infiltraba, qué sé yo, el Pentágono, por dar un ejemplo extremo, y al mismo tiempo nuestras organizaciones políticas estaban infiltradas. Y eso también era cultura. Nada más, ¿eh?
Yeah, well, we're not, I mean, can I just say one thing, please? Yes, infiltrations is one possible term. It might even be considered, at this point, within the territory of art discourse to be a kind of buzzword, a rhetorical device. But on the other hand, we can see that artists in various kinds of projects, working in relation to known or unfamiliar urban territories, do work in collaboration with individuals who inhabit and work within these urban territories. And that's, in a sense, what I meant by infiltration. One can, of course, invoke the more pernicious or malignant notion of infiltration and then turn that around and reinvent what infiltration means in relation to collaboration with agents within the social field. I completely understand what you're saying, and I think within the current circumstances in Mexico, which I do not understand, I can imagine that infiltration might be once again, potentially a pernicious thing. Certainly within the United States, in recent years, in relation to electronic eavesdropping of individuals, large numbers of individuals in the United States, by the government, aided with the cooperation of major telephone communications firms, we also understand the more pernicious effects of infiltration, unfortunately. But that's perhaps another kind of discussion.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, entonces, muchas gracias, Joshua. Pasamos, la dinámica un poco será después de la presentación. Todos los días tendremos un keynote speaker y luego dos conversaciones con artistas y seguido de un panel en el fin del día.